The Tuesday afternoon that should have been ordinary ranch work for Mason turned instead into a surreal battle for his very land. Beginning innocently as he watered calves and checked pens, only to hear the grinding roar of a bus and minivans at his gate, and watch in stunned disbelief as more than 60 strangers spilled onto his pasture-hauling coolers, folding chairs, tents, and picnic tables like they were arriving at a festival ground, not trespassing onto private acreage he had owned and protected for 15 years. At the center of this invasion stood Denise Harper, a familiar HOA face from the neighboring subdivision, strutting with a clipboard, a lanyard badge, and a pre-drawn survey map brazenly stamped Phase 1 seizure, barking orders in a voice meant to carry, food stations by the gate, parking in the pastures, tables to the fence lines. She treated his soil like her personal event venue, moving boundary stakes inward while his livestock cowered and calves huddled in stress. When Mason finally confronted her, she barely looked up, insisting that the community had designated the land for overflow events, twisting HOA memos into false permits, as if that erased his deed. To challenge her empty authority, Mason marched to his power panel and shut off electricity feeding her catering rigs, collapsing her speakers and fridges into silence. The crowd, startled, began murmuring nervously, realizing no one had ever asked the actual owner's permission. Denise quickly switched tactics, pulling out a phone to stream live on social media, framing him as a selfish landowner, blocking cheerful families from community recreation, smiling for the camera while Mason's calves trembled at the chaos. The gaslighting nearly worked until Deputy Martinez responded to Mason's 911 call, asked for permits, and exposed the truth. Denise had nothing but HOA memos, not a single legal authorization. HOA jurisdiction stopped cold at the association boundary. The announcement began unraveling the illusion. Parents yanked children away from livestock pens. Neighbors whispered, "Did we just trespass?" And the shadows of doubt fell heavy. But Denise doubled down by summoning 5 HOA board members, who encircled Mason with clipboards and bogus citations like a suburban assault team, lecturing him about collective good and property values as if ganging up physically could erase land rights. Mason stayed firm, documenting everything with his phone, photographing trampled fences and license plates, and his defiance coupled with the sheriff's neutrality cracked their false confidence. Pressure peaked when County Inspector Ellen Brooks finally arrived after hours of Mason begging for biosecurity accountability. Unlike Denise's hollow props, Ellen's clipboard carried weight, and she methodically documented cross-contamination risks, trampled feed zones, disease hazards, and violations that could have devastated the herd. Crucially, Sarah Williams, the HOA secretary, broke ranks, whispering that she had evidence, then revealing months of incriminating group chat logs labeled Ranch Acquisition Timeline, detailing step-by-step schemes to establish precedent, stage gatherings, create fake paper trails, and petition eminent domain. The chat even included background research on Mason's finances and daily routine, exposing how meticulously they had targeted him as vulnerable. That leak proved the conspiracy, and when Ellen and Martinez saw the digital record, the situation instantly shifted from dispute to criminal fraud and biosecurity endangerment. Cornered, Denise tried to bribe Ellen to dismiss health code citations, accidentally committing felony blackmail in front of cameras, then lashed at Mason in desperation, claiming private property as capitalist conspiracy. The meltdown destroyed what little credibility she had, with even her core supporters recoiling as decades of entitlement erupted into incoherent shouting, while documents fluttered from her arms. By sunset, Ellen had issued $800 in health violations. The deputy added $300 trespass citations. Digital records were handed to the county prosecutor for fraud and conspiracy review, and Denise's once disciplined crowd had scattered, horrified by having been unwitting participants in organized land theft. Within days, HOA boards resigned. Sarah took interim charge, promising reforms. County attorneys prepared fraud counts, and legislators cited Mason's ordeal as evidence for stronger HOA oversight to protect agricultural operations from suburban encroachment. For Mason, exhausted but relieved, the lessons were clear as he stood on his gate that evening. Firm boundaries enforced with law and documentation had preserved his land, and though neighbors might wave respectfully now instead of storming in, he knew the real victory lay not just in defending his calves and soil, but in teaching everyone present that property rights cannot be erased by clipboards, busloads, or live stream propaganda. At the center of this ordeal stands Mason, the the rancher and reluctant protagonist, a man whose daily rhythms revolve around protecting calves and maintaining pastures, thrust suddenly into a battle over ownership that he never sought but had to embrace. Mason embodies the archetype of the quiet guardian, someone measured in his reactions, initially trying reason, but whose patience transforms into spine the moment his calves are threatened, his land trampled and his boundaries mocked. His veterinary technician background deepens his role beyond mere landowner. His knowledge of biosecurity, disease risks, and animal stress becomes the very foundation of his credibility, giving weight to his defense against an HOA's shallow claims. Mason's conflict is not just against individuals, but against a system of arrogance and manipulation, and his role shows how an ordinary man with patience, technical knowledge, and calm persistence can expose fraud by sticking to facts. Opposing him like a caricature and yet a chillingly real antagonist is Denise Harper, the self-styled commander of the HOA, who marches onto his land with a clipboard, lanyard badge, falsified surveyor maps, and a busload of deceived families. Denise is arrogance embodied. Her every line drips entitlement as she declares, "The community has claimed this space," and frames private land as communal asset. Her role is that of a manipulator turned zealot. At first she projects bureaucratic command, later live streams propaganda for public optics, finally spirals into manic rants about property rights being a capitalist conspiracy. She is both petty tyrant and tragic cautionary figure, undone by her own overconfidence and lust for power. A study in how self-anointed authority crumbles when confronted by actual law. Around these central adversaries orbit a cast of allies and foils that bring texture and consequence to the story. Deputy Martinez is the voice of calm law. His straightforward line, "HOA authority stops at the HOA boundary," slices through hours of Denise's jargon like a sheriff's badge cutting through fog. He embodies the role of legitimate authority, professional, impartial, and rooted in real jurisdiction. His presence reassures Mason, but also guides residents who finally understand the difference between HOA memos and county law. Equally impactful is Ellen Brooks, the county health and livestock inspector whose clipboard actually matters. Ellen's role symbolizes science and regulation used properly, where Denise's safety memos are theater. Ellen's documentation of biohazards, cross-contamination, and herd risks transforms neighborly spat into criminal liability. She brings expert weight Mason alone could not carry, validating his warnings and solidifying the legal case. But perhaps the most fascinating character arc belongs to Sarah Williams, the HOA secretary who transitions from silent enabler to courageous whistleblower. Initially standing with board members, she grows visibly uneasy as they circle Mason like predators, and eventually breaks ranks by handing him her phone with incriminating group chats, documenting months of conspiracy planning. Sarah's role is pivotal because she humanizes the gray area. She shows that not all board members are villains, that conscience can overcome fear. Her bravery and evidence give Mason the smoking gun that elevates his defense from anecdotal outrage to prosecutable conspiracy. She represents the theme of conscience awakening inside corrupt systems, and her arc proves that integrity is contagious once one person dares to defect. The board members as a group play the role of the mob, 5 against 1, waving fabricated citations, stacking papers like barricades. They symbolize how collective cowardice enables bullies. Individually, many were unsure, but together they fed each other's boldness until cameras exposed them. Their eventual fracture mirrors how false authority collapses under scrutiny, as personal liability makes each peel away. The neighbors brought on buses serve as another type of character, not villains but pawns and props. Their role is to illustrate mass manipulation, families with coolers and kids streaming in, convinced by Denise's official permits, only to realize mid-picnic they had been used in a land grab conspiracy. Their transformation from cheerful trespassers to embarrassed witnesses represents the shift from ignorance to awareness, showing how deception can unravel quickly once doubt spreads. The livestock themselves almost play symbolic characters. The calves, shoved into corners, huddled in stress, remind Mason why it matters. And in a metaphorical sense, they embody innocence trampled by blindsided greed. They give Mason not just reason but urgency, grounding his role in stewardship, symbolizing the contrast between life sustained and arrogance that destroys. Overlaying all this are the wider figures just outside frame, other county ranchers facing similar encroachment, Legislators later using this story in hearings. Their silent presence reminds us Mason stands not only for himself, but as precedent for countless others. Ultimately, every character here serves to embody a polarity. Mason patience versus Denise arrogance. Martinez clarity versus HOA confusion. Ellen science versus fabricated memos. Sarah conscience versus complicity. Neighbors misled innocence versus awakening witnesses. Livestock life versus property as commodity mindset. Together, their interplay dramatizes how one rancher, initially outnumbered and surrounded, turned the tide by forcing the masks to drop. Denise's fury, Sarah's bravery, Ellen's thoroughness, Martinez's authority, Mason's resilience, they collide in one chaotic afternoon, but resolve into a clear demonstration of roles. False power exposed, real authority reaffirmed, community corrected and land protected. Seen through the legal and regulatory lens, Denise Harper's bold attempt to seize Mason's private ranch pasture with a busload of unsuspecting neighbors unfolds less like a casual HOA misunderstanding and more like a textbook case of trespass, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted blackmail, with each stage of the fiasco highlighting how false authority crumbles under the weight of actual law. From the opening moves, Denise staged her activity with props that mimicked legality. Clipboard, lanyard badge, maps highlighting Mason's land as Phase 1 community seizure, pre-printed signs declaring neighborhood recreation area. Yet legally, none of these trappings amounted to the faintest shred of jurisdiction, because Mason's deed, properly recorded with the county, made the ranch exclusively his. Under Texas Penal Code, the appearance of authority does not substitute for lawful rights, and as soon as families carried chairs over his fence line, the act became clear trespass. As soon as boundary stakes were moved, it became attempted theft of land through fraudulent misrepresentation. Denise's manipulative justification that individual ownership doesn't override collective expansion was especially hollow in law, since property rights are among the most stable rights recognized by courts, and no HOA board may unilaterally expropriate collateral land without due process or eminent domain, both of which require county or state authority she patently did not possess. When Mason killed the power supply to catering rigs, it was more than symbolic defiance. By law, he was entitled, indeed obligated, to protect his infrastructure from unauthorized use, and his action forced the gathering to confront what words alone hadn't made clear. They were occupying land with no legal standing. At this point, Denise shifted tactics into optics and propaganda, live streaming her narrative about community, cooperation, but legally even brilliant. Broadcasts cannot alter the facts, and a trespass under state law remains a trespass, regardless of live view counts. The entry of Deputy Martinez was the first turning point, bringing real authority into play. By demanding to see proper permits and dismissing the HOA memos Denise excitedly brandished as authorizations, the deputy enforced the critical distinction between internal HOA documents and county or state permits. His ruling that HOA jurisdiction ends at the HOA boundary line clarified once and for all that HOA rules bind members only within their platted subdivision, not adjoining private ranches. Residents hearing this began dispersing, realizing the sheriff's office had no recognition of HOA claims, an early collapse of the fraudulent legal front. Legally, Denise's purported permits could be classified under fraud statutes. At minimum, they were counterfeit authorizations misused to compel people into acts of trespass against another landowner. Mason's call to County Health Inspector Ellen Brooks shifted the focus from property rights to regulatory codes. Once Ellen arrived, her documentation reframed the conflict as public health and biosecurity seriousness rather than neighbor squabble. Texas agricultural codes set strict standards concerning contamination risks for livestock, requiring disinfection protocols for visitors, controlling food preparation, and preventing runoff into troughs. By photographing muddy boots trampling feed zones, improperly erected food tables on contaminated soil, and livestock stress behaviors, Ellen created a record of biosecurity violations that eclipsed Denise's rhetorical talking points. At this point, Mason wasn't just a private citizen outraged about intrusion. He was a complainant supported by regulatory documentation showing violations that could have resulted in herd disease, quarantine, and heavy damages. The most damning legal blow, however, came when Sarah Williams, the HOA secretary, provided digital records of incriminating chat logs, the so-called ranch acquisition timeline. These messages documented months of conspiracy, staging family gatherings to create precedent, drafting complaints to frame Mason as hostile, and preparing eventual eminent domain petitions based on so-called community necessity. Such records fulfilled the elements not only of coordinated fraud, but conspiracy to commit fraud, multiple actors agreeing to employ deception to deprive Mason of his rights. Under regulatory scrutiny, the logs demonstrated intentional manipulation, destroying any hope of presenting the event as a misunderstanding. What elevated it further to the criminal realm was Denise's response once cornered. Her whispered offer to Ellen Brooks to ease off violations in exchange for silence, and her subsequent threat of making allegations to smear Mason's ranch if Ellen didn't cooperate. These two actions squarely crossed into obstruction of justice and blackmail, both felonies documented by multiple witnesses, phones, and official reports. In a matter of minutes, Denise had turned her flimsy civil fraud attempt into prosecutable criminal behavior. Martinez's subsequent notes about 3 prior similar complaints against Denise created a pattern of abuse that would further strengthen potential charges. Combined with Ellen's catalog of health violations and Sarah's insider evidence, Mason's case transformed into a prosecutable package: trespassing under penal code, civil conspiracy under property statutes, agricultural health violations causing risk to livestock, fraudulent misrepresentation to neighbors, obstruction of justice and blackmail against a county official, and potential corruption and misuse of HOA authority. The board members circling Mason with folders could individually face liability for participating in the scheme, but under law, their retreat and later resignations reflected their awareness of exposure. Sarah's defection insulated her as cooperating witness. The aftermath legally unfolded quickly. Ellen issued $800 in health code citations. Deputies issued separate trespassing unlawful assembly fines. The county attorney began reviewing fraud and conspiracy charges. HOA insurers faced higher premiums due to liability, and prosecutors debated whether Denise's actions constituted attempted eminent domain fraud. From the regulatory perspective, the broader outcome was transformative. County authorities established clearer educational materials so no HOA could again conflate internal bylaws with county jurisdiction. Ranch biosecurity regulations were emphasized county-wide, with new community awareness sessions. The legal framework was clarified for residents that HOA rules govern only common property, not external agricultural operations. At the legislative level, Mason's ordeal was cited as evidence supporting stronger state oversight of HOA conduct and more explicit protection for agricultural land against residential encroachment schemes. In sum, this conflict, when examined legally, became a vivid case study in how false authority, flashy badges, live-stream spin, and collective bluff cannot override deeds, codes, and statutes. Mason's careful documentation, Ellen's technical inspection, Sarah's whistleblowing, and Martinez's clear-headed enforcement combined to expose not just a violation of his land, but a fraud conspiracy reaching felony levels, proving that in law the loudest voice means nothing when standing on no jurisdictional ground. When the entire episode of Denise Harper's attempted land grab at Mason's ranch is studied thematically, the layers of meaning stretch far beyond an HOA dispute to reveal broader truths about power, responsibility, and integrity. At its most elemental level, the confrontation dramatizes the theme of individual rights versus collective manipulation. Mason symbolizes the enduring principle of ownership: private land earned, nurtured, and safeguarded with sweat equity, backed by title deeds and centuries of legal precedent. His calves huddling in distress and his fields cultivated with care stand as living metaphors of stewardship and lawful possession. In stark opposition, Denise promotes a fabricated narrative of collective expansion, where community desires supposedly override absolute ownership, staging events with buses of neighbors to create a manufactured reality. Her declaration, "Individual ownership doesn't override collective expansion," reveals the heart of the conflict. Whether rights rooted in law and moral duty can be erased by orchestrated crowds and optics of public approval. The theme emerges crystal clear when the sheriff declares what law has always affirmed: HOA borders end at HOAs. This clash makes vivid that true rights cannot be wished away by staged consent. Closely tied is the theme of truth versus optics. Denise's entire operation relies on the power of staged appearances. The clipboard, fake maps labeled Phase 1 seizure, glossy signs reading neighborhood recreation area, live streams angled to portray Mason as an unreasonable loner fighting cheerful families. Her manipulation is built on camera staging and psychological pressure. Mason, by contrast, leans on truth expressed quietly but firmly. Turning off his breakers to halt illegal power use, calling the deputy an inspector, documenting damage with photographs, and presenting cattle stress behaviors and biosecurity risks. The juxtaposition shows the larger theme that no matter how glossy or loud a performance may appear, truth documented by law and science always carries decisive weight. Denise's optics temporarily created doubt and even guilt in Mason's mind, but the moment external authorities examined the facts, appearances evaporated. The thematic lesson resonates powerfully. Truth need not shout, it only needs to endure until witnessed. Another profound theme threading through this confrontation is stewardship versus exploitation. Mason's connection to his ranch is intimate and protective, not simply ownership and paperwork, but lived responsibility for animals, soil, and water systems. When 60 intruders trample his calves' pastures, his outrage is not mere property defense but alarm at possible disease outbreaks, contamination, and the collapse of careful routines critical to herd health. His stewardship represents the ethic of caretaking that land ownership demands. Denise, however, embodies exploitation, viewing land only as a Phase 1 development space, a chess piece to be manipulated for financial or political advantage. Her willingness to shift survey stakes to misuse permits to jeopardize livestock health shows the disregard exploitation always carries for living systems. This theme unfolds starkly when Ellen Brooks, the inspector, sides with Mason's language of herd stress and contamination, stewardship validated by science against exploitation, unmasked by recklessness. The drama also unfolds with the theme of conscience versus complicity. At first, Denise controls the board, and the 5 members who surround Mason with clipboards epitomize how complicity emboldens bullies, individually hesitant, but collectively aggressive. Likewise, neighbors pouring off buses become props, unwitting accomplices lending their bodies as perceived legitimacy. Yet conscience eventually surfaces through Sarah Williams, the secretary whose unease translates into whistleblowing when she reveals the archived chat logs outlining months of conspiracy. Her decision demonstrates the theme that conscience, though often subdued, can emerge powerfully when deception becomes unbearable. By handing Mason her phone, Sarah shifts the balance of power, converting an outnumbered rancher's word into a conspiracy fully exposed. Her role thematically affirms that even within corrupt systems, individuals guided by conscience can dismantle exploitation. The fracture in HOA unity reminds us that complicity, once exposed, can dissolve easily when responsibility looms. Finally, the entire afternoon crystallizes the theme of law versus spectacle. Denise thrives on theater. Live streams, dramatic announcements, staged cooperative families, emotional manipulation using elders on camera. She operates in the terrain of propaganda, betting that the optics of public goodwill will outweigh one man's quiet claim to land. Yet when true law steps in, Deputy Martinez calmly dismissing HOA memos, Ellen cataloging health code violations, prosecutors reviewing Sarah's digital records, the spectacle collapses like an elaborate stage set without foundation. This thematic duel shows the eternal truth that systems built on deception and theater are fragile when law and due process shine light on them. Mason's calm reliance on authority documentation and law shows how true power operates, not through crowds or slogans, but through codified justice. Taken together, these threads of individual rights versus collective manipulation, truth versus optics, stewardship versus exploitation, conscience versus complicity, and law versus spectacle weave the deeper fabric of Mason's narrative. What began as a seemingly absurd scene of neighbors storming a ranch with chairs and coolers becomes a microcosm of timeless struggles between personal dignity and authoritarian theatrics, between caretaking and greed, between reality and manufactured illusion. The lesson lifts beyond Mason and Denise. Private rights endure because they are rooted in stewardship and law. Fabricated authority withers when measured against conscience and truth. By sunset, Mason's herd was calmer, his land once again his, Denise's spectacle reduced to public humiliation, and the community newly aware that what matters in any dispute is not who shouts loudest or stages the best illusion, but who stands on the firm ground of rights, responsibility, and law. If you were scrolling and wanted a wild HOA horror story, this one will glue you to the screen. Because it starts like a normal afternoon on a ranch and spirals into something that sounds like a crime thriller. Imagine this. Mason, a quiet rancher just checking on his calves, hears the rumble of a diesel bus pulling up to his gate. Not one but multiple vans too, spewing out 60 strangers onto his pasture like a weekend flash mob. Coolers hit the ground. Folding chairs popped open, picnic tables set, kids running toward pens, while he stood frozen, wondering if somehow he had missed a county memo giving away his property as a theme park. Front and center, barking orders like a general, was Denise Harper, HOA queen from the adjacent subdivision. Wearing a lanyard badge and carrying a clipboard marked with his property and highlighter, stamped Phase 1 community seizure. And in those few minutes, the hook landed, Denise loudly declaring, "The community has claimed this space," strangers nodding, setting up under her direction, while Mason's calves shoved into corners at the noise and dust. For a moment he thought maybe he was crazy. Maybe he missed some legal notice, but then he saw the signs. Literal pre-printed boards reading Neighborhood Recreation Area. This wasn't spontaneous. This was staged with planning. Money, design, and audacity. The conflict escalated immediately. Mason, his blood rising but still steady, tried reason. "Excuse me, this is my land." "What are you doing?" Denise barely looked up from her papers, announcing with smug confidence that HOA board designation overrode his individual rights. And while the families followed her orders, thinking she had legal backing, Mason did the one thing that cut through the theatrics. He walked to the breaker box and shut off his electricity that was illegally powering their catering rigs. Silence fell as mics and speakers went dead. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Wait, did we trespass?" Nervous eyes darted to Mason, to Denise. For a second, her mask of authority cracked, but she quickly raised her phone, chirped, "We're live online," and turned the scene into a PR stunt, painting him as a selfish landowner denying happy families their community time. The optics hit Mason like a gut punch. He actually doubted himself for a moment until he looked at his calves trembling in a corner pen, dependent on him to block these risks. That reminder stiffened his resolve. This wasn't about being neighborly. It was about defending life, livelihood, and law. Then came the climax. Mason dialed 911, and 20 minutes later, Deputy Martinez rolled up, calm and professional. Denise flourished her folder of permits but Martinez looked over the papers unimpressed and delivered the line that cracked her empire. "Ma'am, these are HOA memos, not legal authorizations. HOA authority ends at the HOA boundary." The words spread like wildfire. Families began folding tables back up, whispering, pulling kids away from the livestock pens. The illusion shattered. But Denise wasn't done. She called in backup from her HOA board. 5 members arriving, fanning out with clipboards in hand and surrounding Mason in a suffocating circle, rattling off fake citations and lecturing about the greater good. Mason, pulse hammering, refused to break, documenting every move with his phone. But at that exact time, County Health Inspector Ellen Brooks arrived, her clipboard official in ways theirs were not. She photographed biosecurity violations, muddy shoe tracks, feed contamination risks, animal stress behaviors. Every point Mason had warned about now captured in government evidence. And the final nail came not from the sheriff or inspector but from inside the enemy camp. Sarah Williams, the HOA secretary, pale and shaking, slipping Mason her phone full of group chat records marked ranch acquisition timeline, outlining in chilling detail a 6-month plan to stage events, move stakes, document unfriendly behavior, and eventually file eminent domain petitions. It was conspiracy spelled out line by line, and when Ellen and Martinez reviewed it, the tone of the day changed. This wasn't a dispute anymore. This was premeditated fraud. The aftermath was a domino collapse. Denise, cornered, tried to bribe Ellen to go easy on the citations, then whispered threats to smear Mason's ranch practices if stops weren't pulled. Both moves backfired spectacularly, witnessed by half the crowd and captured on phones. Textbook obstruction of justice and blackmail. Residents who had believed her that morning recoiled in real time, realizing they were pawns in a con. Videos show her breaking down, shrieking that property rights are capitalist conspiracy, while flinging papers, her once polished image evaporating into a red-faced meltdown. By nightfall, Ellen had issued $800 in county health code violations. Martinez added trespass fines, Sarah's evidence was sent to prosecutors, and multiple HOA members resigned on the spot to avoid liability. Neighbors packed up embarrassed, muttering apologies to Mason for being duped. Denise's staged optics had disintegrated into viral proof of fraud, and then came resolution, the part where the story shifted from survival to reform. Mason, exhausted but relieved, watched his herd settling back into calm as silence returned over the pasture. County attorneys began preparing fraud reviews. Journalists flagged it as another HOA overreach nightmare, and officials pledged stricter oversight so no HOA could ever again conflate internal bylaws with property rights. The HOA restructured under new leadership, with whistleblower Sarah becoming a voice for transparency. For Mason, the true victory wasn't fines or Denise's downfall. It was seeing his calves safe, his land respected, and the entire community educated on one eternal truth. Rights are not erased by clipboards, live streams, or borrowed crowds. They endure because law and stewardship back them. In storytelling terms, the saga closed perfectly. A hook of strangers invading, a climax of law exposing fraud, an aftermath of collapse and apologies, and a resolution of peace restored, showing that sometimes the best plot twist isn't the villain's theatrics, but their total unraveling when the truth finally arrives.